6. The Wanderings starts off with the book Leviticus. It forms the theocracy and what the Levites, priests, are supposed to do in the tabernacle. Unfortunately, there is a problem. The people cannot be in God's presence in the tabernacle because of their sins and uncleanliness. To solve this, God made Aaron the high priest. He would perform different tasks such as making offerings for the people and himself. He wore special garments. He was allowed into the most holy place, however, only once a year. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would take 2 goats. He would slaughter one of them, and sprinkle the blood on the atonement cover. He would then take the other goat, place both hands on it and confess Israel's sins onto it, and send it into the wilderness to be forgotten. This goat was called the scapegoat. The Day of Atonement was an event that would forgive all of Israel's sins and uncleanliness. God also made other new rules for the people to follow in this book, rules regarding cleanliness and uncleanliness, so that the people could be safe within the presence of God. These rules also set them apart from other nations. The book closes with God giving a calling: are you going to obey and be blessed, or are you going to disobey and be cursed? Fortunately, the problem is solved and the people are now able to be in God's presence.
The next book in the Wanderings is Numbers. It begins with the Israelites complaining to God when they are roaming around in the desert. Because of this, God got angry and set fire to rain upon them. This quieted them momentarily, but they began to complain again about the manna they have been eating for a long time. They wanted fresh meat, so God miraculously sends down quails for them to eat. Later on, Moses sends 12 spies to observe the land of Canaan. The spies saw it and they noted that it was a good land, but they were afraid to overtake it, so they gave bad reports about it, so they didn't have to attack it. Only Caleb and Joshua gave truthful reports about it, and the other 10 spies were stricken with plague and died. Unfortunately, the Israelites continued to grumble. They did wrong and did not trust in God's promises. So, God sent vipers upon the Israelites, but then saved them with a bronze snake. The snake resembled Jesus on the cross. This is how the book ends. The last book in the Wanderings is Deuteronomy. It is the reiteration of laws given by God to the Israelites in the previous books. Moses begins by urging the people to obey the laws of God and brings up the past of how God rescued them from Egypt. He then restates the 10 commandments to the Israelites and tells them how to live a godly life, and as God's chosen nation, Israel finally decides to commit themselves to the Lord and to obey God. Lastly, Moses hands authority over to Joshua, blesses the tribes, and dies right after seeing the promised land. However, Moses and his generation cannot enter the land because of punishment for their lack of trust and grumbling.
Joshua, the book in Part 7, The Conquest, is about Joshua of Israel, conquering various cities and defeating armies. The book starts off with Joshua sending 2 spies into Jericho. Their presence is known, so they go to Rahab's place in Jericho to stay at, because it was lodged on the side of the wall, which made it convenient. As a result, when Joshua would later attack Jericho, Rahab and her family would be spared. So, the Israelites march around the city walls 7 times, and the walls crashed down. This is how Jericho was overtaken. Near the end, Joshua gives a speech containing Israel's past and how God has brought them here to this day. He then asks Israel to follow God. A covenant was made between him and the people to follow God wholeheartedly, and to trust in him and not to turn away. Joshua then dies at age 110. The first book in Part 8, Judges and Kings as Judges. It starts off with Israel abandoning the Lord and worshipping idols. So, the Lord raises up judges to save them out the hands that were plundering them. The major judges were Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. The minor judges were Shamgar, Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. These were the judges of the time. The next book is 1 Samuel. Samuel was born from Hannah, who was barren, until she prayed in the temple for a child. When Samuel was born, he was given to the Lord. The Philistines attack Israel and capture the ark. They bring the ark into the house of Dagon, a temple, but it gives the people in the city tumors. So they send the ark back to Israel. Now Israel really wanted a king, so they continually asked for one. Samuel however warned the people that it would be unwise, but the people wouldn't listen. So the Lord grants Israel's request and Saul is chosen as king. Saul reigns and fights many battles, but is rejected by the Lord because he didn't listen to God and kill of all of his enemies. So, David is later anointed as king, and he was given all the fame. This made Saul very angry, and he attempted to kill David several times, all unsuccessful. David even spared Saul when he had the opportunity to eliminate him as a threat. At the end of the book, Saul dies by falling on his sword during battle with the Philistines. The next book is 2 Samuel. It begins with David conquering numerous cities with his troops such as Jerusalem and Philistia. David showed kindness to Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, who was lame, by allowing him to eat at his table. Unfortunately, David one day saw Bathsheba on her rooftop bathing. He called to her and ends up sleeping with her. Then, he basically kills Uriah, Bathsheba's actual husband, by assigning him to the front lines in battle to die. God was not pleased by this. So, David and Bathsheba's first baby was made deathly ill, and then it died, for it was the son of adultery. But God gives them another son later on. On top of adultery, Amnon, one of David's sons, sexually assaults his own sister Tamar. Absalom, who is Amnon's brother, murders him because of this. Then, Absalom tries to become king, but he too gets murdered. This was a very emotional point for David, both his sons dead. Toward the end of the book, the Lord's anger burned against Israel because of their deeds and he sends plague. Israel was getting wrecked by this, until David builds an altar and the Lord answers his prayer. This is how the book ends. Another book in this part is 1 Kings. It starts with David near death. He establishes his son Solomon as the next king, and then he dies. He reigned for 40 years. Israel splits into two, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. God asks Solomon for whatever he wanted and Solomon requests for wisdom, so God grants it. Later on, Solomon shows his wisdom by discerning the correct mother for the living child and the dead child. Solomon is quickly recognized as being one of the wisest person on earth. Next, Solomon builds a grand temple and a palace for himself. The ark goes into the temple. Unfortunately, later on Solomon rebukes God. So God made Israel a bitter enemy for the rest of his reign. Solomon dies after reigning for 41 years. Many others kings come and go. Israel also experiences drought prophesied by Elijah the priest. The book ends with Israel being defeated by Ahab and more reigning kings. The last book in part 8 is 2 Kings. It begins with Elijah being taken up to heaven in a whirlwind of flaming horse-drawn chariots. Many miracles occur, such as the multiplication of bread to feed the 100 prophets. The covenant between the Lord, king, and people gets renewed. Many other kings reign during the time in the north and south. Elisha the priest dies. A crazy event happens where some tomb raiders threw a dead body which landed on Elisha's bones. The dead body came instantly back to life. Menahem reigns over Israel, and he is one of Israel's all-time most evil and brutal kings. They get raided by Assyria twice for they refuse to listen to the Lord. Babylonian exile occurs as prophesied and many people are sent to exile there. This is how the book comes to close, as well as part 8, Judges and Kings.
Part 9, The Return starts with the book Ezra. It begins with King Cyrus appointing the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem after what King Nebuchadnezzar did to it. He then gave special gifts for Sheshbazzar to bring to Jerusalem. On top of that, many Jewish exiles returned from Nebuchadnezzar, 42,360 in all. The temple begins the reconstruction and is finally finished, despite the opposition from the governor Tattenai. Fortunately, the returned Jews get to celebrate Passover with the rest of Israel. King Artaxerxes gives a letter to Ezra the scribe about wanting to send silvers, golds, and valuables to beautify the temple. As a result, the temple is more beautiful than ever. Unfortunately, the Levites intermarried, which polluted the Levite race. Ezra gets appalled by the news, and the people that intermarried get separated. The final book in part 9 is Nehemiah. It starts off when the walls of Jerusalem get torn down and the gate of the city gets burned. So, Eliashib, the high priest, and others, start rebuilding Jerusalem. The governor, Nehemiah, stops oppression of the poor and was generous to the people by not heavily burdening them with taxes like the previous governors. The wall quickly gets finished after 52 days, and when the enemies of the area hear about this, they are afraid, for they perceived that God's hand helped repair. Once again, thousands of exiles return from King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Toward the end of the book, Ezra reads from the book of law to all the people. They declared it a holy day, and everyone rejoiced and celebrated, and confessed their sins. All in all, part 9, the return was a big bounce back for the Israelites. Thank you for watching.